I'm Scott Aniol, and welcome to By the Waters of Babylon. We are in the heart of election season, and as has been true really for a number of years now, this is a difficult one for Christians to decide what are we to do. And I'm not going to answer the question in this episode about who exactly you should vote for, but I do believe that a biblical understanding of the purpose and nature of human government as God has designed it will help us to make proper decisions regarding who we're going to vote for. Questions are often raised. Does the character of the candidate matter? Do the particular policies of the candidate matter? Do the policies of the party matter? What about the issue of abortion and the fact that even the Republican Party seems to be wavering on their position on that very important critical matter? Well, again, these are difficult decisions. These are difficult things to think about. I'm not going to try to overlook that. But on the other hand, I do think that a lot of the angst that Christians experience with regard to who they're going to vote for derives from the fact that we don't have a proper understanding regarding what God designed human government to be. God designed government, and he gave it a very specific purpose, and rightly understanding that purpose, I believe, will help us to understand the nature of government. In Genesis chapter 9, notably after Adam and Eve's fall into sin, and after God's judgment upon sin in the flood, is where we find the official articulation and ordaining by God of human government in a fallen world. We find in Genesis 9:6, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." So here God is giving the responsibility of capital punishment, which is an exercise of his just judgment of sin. God is always sovereign ruler and king over all. But he's giving that responsibility to humankind, and I will note here, not just to redeemed humankind, but to all humankind, as a means through which he will sovereignly control man's sinfulness and preserve the world and its order. And that responsibility in particular, which takes shape in formal human governments over the course of history, has been given, again, to all humankind collectively, believers and unbelievers alike. And so, on that basis, we need to recognize that even unbelieving governors, even governors with poor personal character, when they exercise judgment against wrongdoing, are an extension of God's rule over all. They are doing what God intended when he established government in Genesis chapter 9. And in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 13, we find Paul emphasizing this very point. In Romans 13, verse 1, he says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." The governing authority that Paul is referring to is not the redemptive rule of God over his people. He's not talking about churches or pastors. This is the earthly administration of making laws and enforcing laws that preserve peace and justice in the common everyday affairs of life. This kind of earthly rule, a rule that comes with authority that is derived from the ultimate ruler, God himself, has been instituted by him. And so even something as seemingly mundane and earthly as human government, a magistrate, a mayor, a governor, a president, has been instituted by God in the same way that he has instituted the church with rulers within the government of God's redeemed people. And that's what's important to recognize. God has ordained both spheres, the sphere of the church and the sphere of the state. And he's ordained leaders over both spheres, pastors and magistrates. What is particularly remarkable about Romans chapter 13 is the Roman political situation in which Paul wrote this. For over 500 years, Rome had existed as a republic, but it was now transitioning to a monarchy. Emperor Nero had gained power after his mother had poisoned his father, and under Nero's reign, persecution against the Jews and Christians was on the rise. Taxes were oppressive. It wasn't a good political situation. It's less than ideal, this situation in which Paul instructs Christians to be subject to governing authorities. These are authorities that have no character. They are persecuting Christians, and yet still Paul can say that. Why? Because, as he says, there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. As we've already talked about, God instituted human government, however imperfect that might be, and human government then is a common grace institution. That's important to recognize. It is not a redemptive institution. It is a common grace institution with the purpose of maintaining peace and order in a sin-cursed world. And not only that, consider what Paul says next about a governmental ruler who does what God has instituted in punishing wrongdoing and protecting the innocent. Romans 13, verse 4, "For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." Do you see what he's saying there? He's saying that a government employee, like a governor, a legislator, a police officer, who does his job and enforces laws that help to establish peace and order in society, is a servant of God. And he goes on to say that when a governor, a magistrate, punishes wrongdoing, he is actually carrying out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Paul calls magistrates literally deacons of God. But remember, he says this of even pagan Roman governors who don't acknowledge the fact. These are immoral men. They didn't believe that they were serving on God's behalf. But nevertheless, they were deacons of God when they carried out God's wrath, similar to how the Lord called King Cyrus his anointed in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1. God is ruling over all of his universal common kingdom, but he is doing so through unbelieving human rulers. But there's another important point to recognize here, and that is, since God is the one who instituted human government as an extension of his providential rule over all, human governments are subject to the moral law of God. Human governments are not ultimate. Governments must operate as God intends them to operate. And even pagan rulers can, in the common grace of God, abide by and enforce the moral law of God. Paul articulates in Romans chapter 2, verse 14, the reality of when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, even though they do not have the law. They show, Paul says, that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. This is what Greg Bahnsen referred to as borrowed capital. It's when pagans are actually borrowing from biblical values in certain areas of their lives, even though they don't know it, even though they don't affirm it, even though it is consistent with what they say they believe. Pagans who are made in the image of God, nevertheless, sometimes take advantage of God's common grace and do what the law requires. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that the realm of politics is somehow a neutral sphere. The fact is that there is no neutrality on any issue. Every matter is either consistent with God's law or it contradicts God's law. There's only right or wrong, good or bad, light or dark. The only grounding for successful living that makes consistent sense in God's world is one rooted in the authoritative truth of God's holy word and repentant faith in Christ. That's the only consistent way to live. But because all men are made in the image of God, because the heavens are telling the glory of God, and God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, and because God does show common grace to even the unjust, unbelieving people often reflect a transcendent morality in their lives that is actually inconsistent with their stated belief system. And so, Governments that help to establish and enforce general morality in society are doing God's work to preserve peace and order, even when those governments do not even acknowledge or recognize that they are doing so. And the fact is, really, if you look throughout history, all successful political systems have done this to one degree or another. Societies with pagan magistrates throughout history have sought to build their political systems on transcendent morality, even though they could not fully account for it in their own belief system. The pagan Greco-Roman thought of Paul's day embodied transcendent moral grounding for its political philosophy as they applied God's law written on their hearts. C.S. Lewis makes this observation in both Mere Christianity and The Abolition of Man. And in the latter book, there's an appendix where he gives many examples of civil laws from various nations around the world that are an embodiment of transcendent morality that ultimately comes from God. They are the very laws that we, in our current political situation, ought to be promoting and supporting. Pagans can recognize the wisdom of these laws and keep them, though in truth to do so is inconsistent with their own pagan worldview. But they often do so, and that's what we ought to be promoting. Those are the kinds of people we ought to be voting for, those who promote policies that are consistent with the transcendent moral law of God. Throughout history, pagans have often figured out successful legal systems that reflect biblical values because since God designed the world to work in a certain way, those kinds of systems just work best for the order and prosperity of a society. That's the reality of common grace politics. The truth is that in matters of the state, the only two options are not, as some insist, Christ or chaos. In his kind providence, God specifically designed human government to provide a third common grace option given to all humankind that imperfectly preserves a degree of order and peace until Christ establishes his perfect theocratic kingdom on earth. God's covenant with Noah in Genesis 9 reveals God's plan to preserve humankind and creation until the second Adam establishes his earthly rule. Because of the reality of human rebellion, God provided measures by which, in his providence, he would preserve the stability of a cursed world through the earthly institution of human government, with its God-given responsibility of capital punishment. Before the flood, it was Christ or chaos, and it quickly devolved into chaos. After Genesis 9, and especially after Babel, nations formed and prevented chaos as God works his plan of redemption throughout history for his people. Now, it's important to recognize, and this is key for our voting, that no human government is perfect. No human government will be perfect until Jesus comes again. But imperfect, common grace order is why God created human government in the first place. He didn't create it to establish utopia. Utopia will come when Jesus comes. It's also important to recognize that since God is the one who instituted government, government has limited jurisdiction. God's initial institution of government in Genesis 9 explicitly designated the specific jurisdiction that God appointed for the institution, the protection of innocent human life. And additionally, Romans 13 also reiterates the kind of morality that God has charged government to enforce. Romans chapter 13, verse 8, "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." In other words, in the context, in Romans 13, of Paul's discussion of governing authorities, that context indicates what aspects of God's moral law he has appointed governors to enforce, namely what is sometimes called the second table of God's law, those commandments 6 through 10 that involve the relations between humans. These are God's moral laws that involve human relationships, And that is what human government has been instituted to enforce. Government has not been given jurisdiction to enforce all of God's moral law. Magistrates have not been tasked with enforcing the first table of God's moral law, those laws that involve humans and their relationship with God. Adherence to those laws comes only when the Holy Spirit of God regenerates a human heart, writing those laws upon the heart so that believers in Jesus Christ voluntarily submit themselves to those laws. And so, establishment of the first table of God's moral law falls under the jurisdiction of the church, not government, and only through the divine weapons of the Word, while the second table of the law, interaction between individuals, falls under the jurisdiction of government. So this means extremely limited government that has jurisdiction exclusively involving the punishment of murder, theft, and other crimes against human life and safety. As Thomas Jefferson famously quipped, government is best which governs least. Full theocracy is not the goal, but simply the preservation of human life and safety in a sin-cursed world. This understanding of human government is what ought to fuel our voting. We ought to vote. We're not voting for a pastor. We're not voting for a Christian prince. We're not voting for someone who will establish the first table of the law. We're not voting for someone who will enforce Christian morality in every sense. We are voting for individuals and policies that will do what God designed government to do: protect human life and maintain, at some level, peace and order in a sinful society. That's what should inform our decisions. And for more on this, I would encourage you to take a look at my book, Citizens and Exiles, Christian Faithfulness in God's Two Kingdoms, where I outline God's plan in history to establish both a redemptive rule over his people and to superintend in his providence over the common grace institutions of this world, including human government. I think if you read that book, it'll help you think biblically about how to vote in this election season. I hope this was helpful for you. Please like and subscribe to this podcast on YouTube and other podcasting services. Please share this with other people, and join me next time on the next episode of By the Waters of Babylon.